What if one of the most misunderstood communities in American history has been telling the truth about its roots all along? And what if modern DNA didn't destroy their story but proved it was deeper, sharper, and more powerful than most history books ever admitted? Before we go any further, do this with me. Like this video if you love hidden history, subscribe. If you want stories the textbooks rushed past, and share this with one person who still thinks the past is simple. For generations, people looked at the Gullah-Geechee and told a very neat story. It sounded respectful. It sounded complete. It sounded safe. The idea was simple. Enslaved Africans were taken to the coastal south, cut off on islands and plantations, and by chance, they managed to keep a few broken pieces of Africa alive. A little language here, a little food there, some songs, some beliefs, some memories. It was presented almost like a miracle of survival, but also like an accident, as if culture just somehow floated in the air for 300 years and refused to die. But that story always had a problem. The Gullah-Geechee did not preserve random fragments. They preserved patterns. They preserved systems. They preserved ways of speaking, ways of cooking, ways of praying, ways of naming, ways of farming, ways of remembering. That is a very different thing. Random fragments fade. Systems survive because people rebuild them on purpose. And that is where the mystery begins. Who exactly were the Gullah-Geechee? Why did their culture stay so vivid when so much else was torn apart by slavery? Why did their language sound close to English, yet carry rhythms and structures that clearly came from somewhere else? Why did their foodways, basket traditions, spiritual practices, and relationship to the coastal land feel so specific, not vague, not symbolic, but precise? And now the question has become even more intense because DNA has entered the story, not rumor, not folklore alone, not outsider guesswork, DNA. What researchers found did confirm part of the old understanding. The Gullah-Geechee do have very strong ancestry from West Africa. But the deeper finding is what changes the emotional force of the story. The evidence suggests this was never just a blurred African memory surviving in isolation. It points to a people with unusually strong links to particular regions of West Africa, especially the old rice-growing coast, and to a community that held on to far more ancestral continuity than most Americans were ever taught to imagine. To understand why that matters, we have to go back to the coast. The Gullah-Geechee are descendants of enslaved Africans brought to the lower Atlantic coast of what is now North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Over time, the culture became most strongly associated with the Sea Islands and Low Country regions, especially in South Carolina and Georgia. These were wet, tidal, marshy, dangerous places by colonial standards. They were difficult to move through. Disease was common. Summer conditions scared many white planters, who often preferred to stay away for long stretches. That mattered more than most people realize. Because when enslavers stayed distant, space opened, not freedom. Never confuse the two. The plantation system was violent, extractive, and cruel from top to bottom. But inside that brutality, there were places where enslaved communities had more room. They could speak to each other, teach each other, marry, bury, cook, worship, and pass on habits without constant, direct interference. On the coastal rice and Sea Island plantations, that space could become the difference between total erasure and cultural endurance. That is why people often say the Gullah-Geechee survived because of isolation. And yes, isolation mattered. But isolation alone cannot explain this level of survival. Other communities have lived far from centers of power. Other populations have been cut off by geography. Distance by itself does not create a living language. Distance by itself does not preserve deeply rooted agricultural knowledge across generations. Distance does not explain why scholars found African personal names, African vocabulary, African storytelling structures, and African ritual elements still recognizable centuries later. Isolation can protect something. But first, there has to be something strong enough to protect. And that brings us to the first major clue: rice. Long before rice made white planters rich in South Carolina and Georgia, people in parts of West Africa already knew how to grow it in difficult environments. This was not simple field labor. It was highly skilled ecological knowledge. It involved water control, flood timing, and soil behavior. It required seasonal judgment, processing techniques, and generations of practice. Historians have shown that enslavers were not just buying bodies for brute labor. They often wanted expertise. They wanted people from the so-called rice coast of West Africa, a broad region stretching from Senegal through Sierra Leone and Liberia. They wanted them because those people knew things Europeans did not. Think about how dark that truth is. People were not only captured because they were vulnerable. Many were captured because they were valuable. Their knowledge increased the price on their heads. That changes how we see the whole history. The ancestors of the Gullah-Geechee were not merely dragged into a strange land and somehow lucky enough to remember home. Many of them were forced across the Atlantic precisely because they carried practical, transferable knowledge of a coastal world. They understood rice, they understood waterways, they understood the rhythm of wetland labor. And when they reached the low country, the landscape was brutal. But it was not entirely unfamiliar. The marsh, the mud, the heat, the tidal flow, the labor system built around rice cultivation, these were conditions in which African knowledge could still function. That is a painful irony. The very expertise that made them targets for slavery also helped preserve pieces of their civilization. And once you see that, the Gullah-Geechee story stops looking accidental. It starts looking intentional. It starts looking like reconstruction. Now add the language. For a long time, outsiders dismissed Gullah speech as broken English. That was ignorance pretending to be education. Scholars eventually showed that Gullah is a real Creole language, shaped by English but deeply influenced by African languages and speech patterns. In the 20th century, the linguist Lorenzo Turner documented thousands of African words and names in Gullah speech. He found links to languages spoken along the West African coast. He also recorded names and expressions that connected strongly to places like Sierra Leone. This matters because language is one of the first things slavery tries to crush. If you want to destroy a people, you separate families, rename the captured, punished native speech, and mix groups together. You turn communication into a weapon of control. Enslavers understood this very well. That is exactly why the survival of Gullah is so extraordinary. It was not just a few borrowed words. It was a community building a shared voice under conditions designed to prevent exactly that. And the similarities are striking. Researchers and educators have long noted strong connections between Gullah and Creole in Sierra Leone. They noted many words and names that point back to West African origins. Not because the two are identical, they are not, but because they emerge from overlapping historical worlds shaped by Atlantic slavery, African language contact, and Creole development. So by the time DNA research arrived, the Gullah-Geechee story already had powerful clues built into it. The land suggested one history, the rice suggested another, the language suggested another, the names, food, baskets, ritual life, and oral tradition suggested even more. What DNA did was not create the story from nothing. It tightened the focus. It gave the conversation a new kind of proof. One important genetic study published in recent years examined Gullah African Americans and compared them with other populations. The results were remarkable. The Gullah showed the highest average African ancestry proportion of any United States African American population studied. The average was about 90% African ancestry, with lower European admixture than many other groups in the South. Pause on that for a second. That does not mean the Gullah-Geechee were somehow untouched by American history. Of course they were touched by it. They were shaped by the trauma of slavery, violence, exploitation, family separation, and all the wreckage that came with those systems. But the genetic picture suggests that the Sea Island communities remained more closely tied, biologically and historically, to African ancestral populations. In plain English, they were not just culturally close to Africa, they were, on average, genetically closer too. Quick pause here. If this kind of history changes how you see America, tap like, join the channel, and pass this video to one person who loves learning. That alone would be enough to make this a huge story. But then comes the twist that too many dramatic retellings get wrong. The DNA did not say, mystery solved, the Gullah-Geechee come only from Sierra Leone. That would make for a clean headline, but it would flatten the truth. The actual finding was more interesting and more honest. Researchers found they were related to Sierra Leoneans, but they were not exclusively descended from them. Their ancestry reflects ties to multiple West African populations. This includes people from the wider, rice-growing coast and surrounding regions. In other words, the answer was not a single village with a perfect label. The answer was a corridor, a human map, a network of coastal African peoples whose skills, languages, and traditions traveled together. That matters because it rescues the story from two different mistakes. The first is, they just held onto vague remnants because they were isolated. The second is, DNA proved they came from one exact place and now we know everything. Neither is true. The deeper truth sits between them. The Gullah-Geechee were shaped by a concentrated but diverse set of West African roots. They were tied to regions where rice cultivation, coastal ecology, and certain language traditions were already well developed. Their culture endured because enough people carrying overlapping knowledge and practice were forced into the same world and kept rebuilding life together. That is a completely different emotional picture. It means the Gullah-Geechee were never merely leftovers of Africa. They were makers of continuity. They were curators of survival. They were architects of memory. The Gullah-Geechee story is not locked into one tiny place people can romanticize from a distance. The culture stretches across a long corridor. From North Carolina down into Florida, it exists. Even if the image centers on South Carolina and Georgia, that range tells us something important. We are not looking at a single frozen village. We are looking at a historical world connected by water, labor, kinship, trade, and memory. That wider map also helps explain why the names Gullah and Geechee carry so much weight. They point to people who built a shared identity, They built it in the aftermath of forced migration, while still carrying echoes of multiple African origins. Over time, that identity became strong. It survived emancipation, war, migration, schooling, mockery, and the demand to assimilate without leaving a trace of where you came from. The federal recognition of the Cultural Heritage Corridor says something bigger than tourism. It is an admission that this culture is not a footnote. It is part of the core American story, foundational history. The rice economy was built on stolen knowledge and enslaved labor, and the descendants of the people who made the wealth did not vanish after the profits were taken. They remained. They remained, carrying the memory of how this country was built. And once you realize that, every part of the culture looks different. The food is no longer just Southern food with African influence. Rice dishes, okra, greens, and spice patterns begin to look like evidence. The baskets are no longer just beautiful crafts for tourists. Sweetgrass basket making carries old African design logic into a new land. The ring shout is no longer just an interesting ritual survival. It becomes a testimony to spiritual forms that crossed the Atlantic. Even the sense of rootedness to land changes meaning. When elders speak about the tides and the marsh, they are not only speaking poetically, they are speaking from a culture shaped by close environmental knowledge. This matters because of the lie that enslaved people arrived as blank labor. They did not. They arrived with technologies, techniques, memories, naming systems, cosmologies, and agricultural science. Slavery tried to reduce them to labor units. Gullah-Geechee history exposes that lie. If you are still with me, take 10 seconds and hit subscribe. Like the video if you want more truth, and send it to someone who thinks Ancestry is just percentages on a screen. Now, here is where the emotional center of the story gets even stronger. When outsiders hear that DNA supports continuity, many imagine surprise. But for many community members, the feeling has not been surprise at all. It has been recognition. That difference is everything. Because the modern world loves to act as if a people are only real once a lab confirms them. But communities know themselves. They know themselves long before institutions catch up. Oral tradition is not worthless because it is oral. Memory is not fake. Cultural memory is real, even if it is not written in the language of academic power. Elders do not become credible only when a university arrives. So, when science says there are unusually strong ties to African ancestry in specific regions, many people hear revelation. But many Gullah-Geechee descendants hear affirmation. That is not the same thing. For centuries, they kept names and stories. They kept ways of cooking rice, language patterns, burial customs, songs, prayers, herbal knowledge, and family rhythms. They kept enough that even when details blurred, the direction of memory stayed alive, and that direction mattered. The people most often confused about the Gullah-Geechee were outsiders, scholars who underestimated them, histories that flattened them. Audiences taught to think black culture in America began only after arrival on these shores were the ones who were wrong. The Gullah-Geechee themselves were not empty of knowledge. They were not waiting for DNA to give them an identity from scratch. What DNA really did was expose how small the mainstream imagination had been. It showed that the old story was too thin. It is more comfortable to believe enslaved people lost almost everything, because then you do not have to confront how much they rebuilt. It is more comfortable to say culture survived in fragments, because then you do not have to admit they carried civilizations with them. It is more comfortable to think of the Gullah-Geechee as isolated curiosities than as evidence that slavery never achieved cultural death. That is why this history feels so heavy. It is not just about ancestry. It is about the limits of erasure. And erasure was the point. The slave trade tried to break lineages. Plantation slavery tried to break community. American racism tried to break memory. Development pressure, land theft, and displacement have continued that damage into modern times. Gullah-Geechee land remains under threat from rising costs, and outside investors deciding heritage only matters after it can be sold. So when we talk about DNA, we should not talk about it like a magic trick. This is not entertainment or a sleek reveal. These findings matter because they stand inside a much older struggle over who gets to define truth. The archive of slavery was built by people who bought and sold human beings. Of course, that archive is incomplete. Names are missing. Of course, villages disappear into ledgers. The system had no interest in protecting the full humanity of the people it exploited. But bodies kept a record. Families kept a record. Language kept a record. Land kept a record. And now science, history, and community memory are starting to speak to each other in ways that are hard to ignore. Still, the most honest version of the story leaves room for complexity. Not every feature can be mapped cleanly onto one group. Not every family line can be traced to one exact coastline. That complexity should not disappoint us. It should mature us. Because real ancestry is rarely a simple sentence, especially when violence interrupted it. What makes the Gullah-Geechee case extraordinary is that evidence from language, agriculture, memory, and genetics all begins to converge. They converge toward West Africa, toward the rice-growing coast, toward a story in which knowledge traveled with the enslaved. It survived the crossing and was rebuilt on American shores with astonishing strength. Maybe the most haunting part is this. The preservation of that culture may have been helped by the very greed that enslaved it. Planters wanted productivity and profit. In trying to extract the value of African knowledge, they accidentally created conditions in which parts of it stayed alive. That is not redemption. There is nothing redemptive about slavery, but there is something profoundly human about the refusal of people to become what was imagined. The Gullah-Geechee were supposed to be reduced to labor. Instead, they remained a people. That may be the most important sentence in this entire story, because once a people remain a people, history never fully wins. Now imagine what this means for the future. If the Gullah-Geechee preserved this much, what else in the diaspora has been underestimated? What foods are really encoded memory? What rhythms, farming habits, or healing traditions still carry maps of the Atlantic world? How many communities have been told their history is too broken, when in fact the clues are all around them? This is bigger than one Ancestry result. It forces us to ask better questions. Not, did African culture survive? Clearly it did. But how did it survive? Through which workers, which storytellers, which church mothers, which children listening on porches at dusk? And how much of American culture has always depended on knowledge that America refused to honor? The deeper you go, the more you realize this is not a side chapter. It is a warning against shallow history itself. It shows what happens when outsiders confuse written records with total truth. It shows how much remains alive outside recognition. It shows that communities can carry archives in the body, the tongue, the kitchen, and the memory of elders long before anyone pays attention. If this is opening your eyes, comment with the word roots, so I know you made it this far, and subscribe for more. Share this with somebody who needs to hear that survival is sometimes far more organized than it looks. There is one more layer. For descendants of the slave trade, ancestry is also grief. Every confirmation contains an absence. Every clue points to what was taken. Every region identified reminds you that names and kinship ties were torn apart by force. DNA tells you where to look, but not who was lost. It cannot give back every stolen detail. That is why cultural preservation matters so much. Language, song, and food let the past stay intimate. A percentage can inform you. A spoken phrase can move you. A rice dish can connect you. A basket woven by hand can carry history in a way a chart never will. The true ancestry was never hidden only in DNA. It was hidden in plain sight, in the sound of the language, in the shape of the baskets, in the names kept, in the coastline known. DNA did not invent that truth. It illuminated it. It gave modern institutions a way to see what the culture said for generations. The Gullah-Geechee look like a revelation of what slavery could not finish, a living argument against total erasure. They crossed the ocean under terror, entered a system designed to strip them bare, and still carried forward a world. That should humble us. The real shock is not that their ancestry was complex. The real shock is that so many people ever thought it was simple. Remember what is actually standing in front of you. You're looking at one of the clearest surviving archives of African continuity. You're looking at proof that memory can live in a people even when paper fails, even when power looks away. It is about what human beings can carry through hell and still refuse to surrender. Share this story and subscribe for the next one. Leave a like so more people can find it. Some histories survive quietly, and they only stay alive when we choose to pass them forward. The Gullah-Geechee were never a mystery waiting to be explained. They were a memory the world kept underestimating. The real question is no longer who they were. The real question is why it took the rest of us so long to listen.